like what Jon Kent has become. So Jon Kent was a character introduced in 2015 during an event called Convergence, which was weird. By the end of the event, Superman, Lois, and now Jon Samuel Kent were brought into the mainstream DC universe. And with DC Rebirth, Jon became Superboy. Sorry, Connor. And we focused on the relationship between him, Damian, his parents. That was great. I do wish he interacted more with Connor Kent at this age because there was a ripe story potential. Did I say age? Oh, right. Then everything changed when Bendis began writing the Superman comics. He had Jon taken into space with Jor-El, had him tortured for 6 years, and then aged him up. Jon was marooned on Earth 3, the version of Earth where the good guys are bad and the bad guys are good. It is here where he spent several years being tortured by Ultraman, who is evil Superman on that world. Does the trauma of being tortured by a man who looks and sounds exactly like dear old dad reap any storylines? Trust issues? Paranoia? Haha! Getting over it was super easy, barely an inconvenience. I don't ask for comics to be realistic, but this is decent story material discarded way too early. I barely recall any instance of him being magicked up to 17 not causing any age-up angst since he's now so much older than members of his supporting cast he once had. Putting aside the sloppy job of aging him up, he also lost a ton of uniqueness. We started out with a lot of teenage heroes. The original X-Men were teenage heroes. The Teen Titans, it's in the name. Spider-Man started as a teenage hero. We don't get that many dedicated preteen heroes. This presents a unique dynamic since children tend to be dependent on their parents and thus familial and superheroic relationships can be strained in ways other than what we see with semi-autonomous teenagers. Tomasi did a good job of humanizing Superman through parenthood, and I think he actually used his own experience as a parent in order to help write this, which shows. It's a shame this all went away. I also like seeing characters grow up and mature over time, even if there are writing bumps in the way. We don't get that with Jon. We see what amounts to a writer hitting a big red button and aging him up, wiping away all good story opportunities, and sweeping the implications under the rug. Oh, and he came out as bisexual and started dating this Jay Nakamura guy. I hate Jay Nakamura. I'll let the Damien and John and Kathy and John shippers rip him apart for me in the comments section. The fundamental flaw in writing Jon Kent, besides being as boring as watching paint dry, is how he is a legacy character in an era where we have an implosion of legacy characters. His title might be Superman, but we already have a Superman. Krypton exploded and sent Clark Kent to Earth. Under Mon Pa Kent, he became the compassionate pillar of hope we all know him as. Superman is so iconic that people who have never picked up a comic know the beats of his origin story. For iconic characters, comics have a very high level of inertia for getting legacy characters on the same level, if not more. Blue Beetle or Moon Boy, then your legacy character is the iconic character. But if you're Clark Kent as Superman, good freaking luck that the legacy character will overshadow you at all, especially if you are related in universe. Clark Kent is Superman, Superman is Clark Kent, and Jon is just the son of Superman. DC and Marvel have undergone legacy implosion. We have like half a dozen Green Lanterns and multiple people who have held the mantle of Flash. There's also like half a dozen characters who have held the mantle of Robin. Jon is just another redundancy in the redundancy and inflation that is legacy characters. As much as I would like to see him de-aged, mainly for the fun Super Sons comic again, I don't think that's going to be a viable strategy at all. Oh, introduce a bisexual Superman and then DH him back to an 11-year-old? That's bad for the Twitter hellscape. And you know, the Twitter hellscape doesn't need to be factual. For the 2011 Green Lantern movie, I remember people thinking Green Lantern was whitewashed. Jon Stewart was Green Lantern for a long time because of that amazing Justice League cartoon. I am not against the concept of legacy characters in general. I, however, am against the concept of inflating the cast with legacy characters. And you can't just get rid of them once you introduce a legacy character. You can't just kill them, you can't just depower them, and you can't just put them on a bus to nowhere. Some fan will look at that and eventually try to rectify that when they become a writer at DC or Marvel. Looking at you, Jeff Johns. At best, you can condemn them to comic book limbo. Comic book limbo is probably one of the biggest problems of legacy characters. That's very easy to throw them into comic book limbo. All the writer needs to do is simply not give them a role in a bloated cast, which makes them fade into the background, and thus limbo easily. I, for the life of me, can't remember the last time Kyle Rayner got a story. even giving them fleshed out and unique identities like the Bat Family. Nightwing, Red Hood, and Spoiler were all Robins at one point. People really only know Nightwing and Red Hood. For whatever reason, DC dislikes Stephanie Brown. Once more, not having a vision for this large cast causes problems, as some just fade into the background and others just end up in stupid storylines. Looking at you, Tim Drake. There are plenty of stories where a character not having a proper place in the story leads to idiotic storytelling choices. What happens when you don't find a proper place for a character is how they end up getting mischaracterized, derailed, and of course, enraging the fans to no end. This is what happened with Wally West during Heroes in Crisis. They couldn't give him a proper place in the DC universe after his return, so they unintentionally, or intentionally, derailed him into this mopey shell of a man who is also a murderer, which I'm sure this is retconned. And I'm hoping something like this won't happen with Jon, but when you have similar powers, gimmicky power changes and additions become commonplace. I'm looking at you, Stupid Man Red and Stupid Man Blue. For crying out loud, Super Sons parodied this concept. There's also the issue of characterization. Barry Allen is probably the best example of this as a case study. He was dead for around 20 years, from the end of Crisis on Infinite Earths to the early 2000s. Wally West was the Flash for 20 years. Naturally, writers would occasionally write Barry like they would write Wally, which makes sense since they spent so much time writing Wally. 20 years is nothing to scoff at. Needless to say, his characterization in those terrible Justice League films did not help this problem in the slightest. For Superboy, some of it's deliberate. Clark inspired the Legion of Superheroes. Under Bendis' pen, it's Jon who takes up the role of Superboy on the team. And given that he inspired the worst incarnation of the Legion to date, I am not impressed at all. This is a perfect example of my whole saying, the first time you tell a story, it's legendary. The second time you tell it, it's a parody. I'm done here. Please consider liking, subscribing, and tipping me on Ko-fi.